"Thank you very much," he said, and then he was gone. I too was gone and nearly out for the count in Winnipeg. Outside the hotel, it was minus 25 Celsius. I decided to go for a walk to see what would happen. Halfway round the small square in front of the hotel, my eyes and nostrils had frozen. I could barely breathe, let alone see, and I just made it back to the lobby. Do not fuck with Canada. We were fully in the grip of a continental winter. It took 36 hours to get over the Rockies to Vancouver, with snow chains and escorts crawling at 4 or 5 miles an hour. I'd never seen weather on such a big scale, so close up. When people say bad weather in England, it usually means it's wet. In North America, bad weather means you might die. Christmas was brief and shell-shocked. We finished at the Rosemont Horizon near Chicago, and stir-crazy did not begin to describe the atmosphere. We were so desperate to return home, we paid to go on Concorde. There was a super early flight on a 747 from Chicago to New York that meant we could catch the 9 a.m. Concorde to arrive that evening in London. Before leaving, we partied like it was 1999, and I dressed up as Sherlock Holmes and wandered around the hotel with a walking stick, beating up light bulbs. After a brief period of unconsciousness, as opposed to sleep, I somehow ended up in first class at 7 a.m. in the pitch dark of a Chicago winter morning. The cabin crew came round and asked for drinks orders. I wanted a glass of water. The businessman behind me grunted loudly. "I think I'll have a Bloody Mary," he said. "Guess it's gonna be one of those days." Drunk as I still was, it already was one of those days. Concorde was small, the seats were cramped, and the menu was amazing. There was lobster and champagne, and I woke up in London. I had passed out and slept through the entire experience. Not a single morsel of food had passed my lips. Seeing as it was Concorde, though, they gave me a bottle of champagne to take home as a consolation. So out of my brain, I don't remember Concorde. That's almost rock and roll. Chapter 21. The Boys from Brazil. Rumours were afoot of a dramatic and exotic development, an undiscovered continent. Iron Maiden was about to go Brazil nuts. We were headed south to Rio de Janeiro. I'd never heard of Varig Airlines or held a Brazilian banknote. I had no idea where Copacabana Beach was, or the Corcovado or Sugarloaf Mountain. I'd never met the girl from Ipanema and never tasted a caipirinha. Brahma was an Indian monk, not a beer, and I had no idea that wiggling your bottom could be a national sport. I also had no idea who Frank Sinatra's lawyer was. Rock in Rio, the first one ever, was a 10 on any scale of 1 to 10. I suppose I could get picky about the band or my performance, but actually that isn't the point. It was a show that broke Iron Maiden in an entire continent overnight. Initially, we turned it down. In the throes of selling out American shows back-to-back, a 2-week break in Brazil seemed like madness. Yet the Rock in Rio offer seemed too good to be true. At every turn, their lawyer just said, "Yes, we want you to do 2 shows in 2 weeks. We only do 1. Yes." And so it went on. First-class travel, a massive fee, merchandising equivalent to a week of sold-out US shows, personal spending money, luxury hotels, guaranteed air freight for 30 tons of equipment. The answer was always, yes. Anything else? On arrival in Rio, our clothes were almost torn from us by screaming fans, many of them extraordinarily good-looking females. We were pursued to our hotel on Copacabana Beach, which itself was surrounded 24 hours a day by hundreds of fans. For the next week, we would be prisoners in the hotel along with several other artists until the moment we were released to go to the festival. And what an incredible enterprise the whole thing was. 3 full stages had been created with a railway track laid down to rotate them before a specially designed and constructed festival setup with a capacity of 300,000 people. The biggest stars from the international music world, plus all the biggest local talent, were playing in a non-stop orgy of entertainment for 2 weeks. The TV rights alone were worth a fortune. Cynics might say the whole operation was a huge money laundering operation. One thing was for sure, there was certainly a lot of it washing around. We just enjoyed the ride, quite literally. The last time I'd been in a helicopter was when I was chucked out of the side of a Westland Wessex into a tick-infested forest in Thetford. Today was somewhat more luxurious as we climbed aboard for the 10-minute ride to the festival site. We were not yet headliners. That honour belonged to Queen, who were on stage after us. Even so, it was clear that there was massive expectation for Maiden. The festival site itself was a chaotic blur. Tempers and tensions were running high backstage. There was a barely visible sense of order and a sense that disorder might break out at any time. 2 rival security firms were at each other's throats. Both had dogs and both had guns. They were involved in a standoff outside our dressing room. Leashed, fanged beasts with spiked collars were being held at bay at opposite ends of the corridor. We waited in our dressing room for the signal that the stage was ready, oblivious to the commotion. In the hallway outside, guns were brandished, and there was much trading of insults and presumably aspersions cast about family members in Brazilian Portuguese. Once it all cooled off and the guns were holstered, we got the green light. Rio was the biggest crowd I have ever played, and probably ever will. It seemed to disappear beyond the horizon, past the hazy floodlit pools of colour and into the blackness. The surge of adrenaline as we ran out was immense, like a dozen Olympic 100-metre starts rolled into one. All these people, all that emotion, and the sound was awful. We brought our own monitors, but some of the gear was local, and the monitor engineer was a stranger. I waved my arms, trapped between a rock and a hard place. You can't stop in front of 300,000 people and do a sound check. By the time we got to Revelations, I'd put on my rather natty electric blue Ibanez guitar. It matched the rather stylish electric blue acoustic Ovation that I still have. The anger built as I tried to communicate with the engineer at the side of the stage. Hot and bothered, I wrenched the guitar off over my head and split my forehead open on its wooden edge. My head was bleeding profusely as I approached the monitor board. The engineer saw the blood and looked horrified. "Fucking fix the sound! Don't fucking stand there like a goldfish!" I ranted. I expect I looked like a raving lunatic, which at that moment I was. To prove a point, I smashed my guitar across the mixing desk and broke it halfway down the neck. "Fix it!" I screamed. The sound did not improve. So, I threw all the wedge monitors off the front of the stage. Crowds love this sort of thing. They think it's showtime. Well, sometimes it may be, but sometimes it's not. This whole spectacle was being shown live on TV across millions of Latin American households. I did a bit more singing and then went back behind the amps to calm down a bit. A roadie gave me a towel to wipe the blood away from my eyes. And then another member of the crew showed up, very excited. He looked carefully at the wound. "Rod says, 'Can you squeeze it and make it bleed some more?' he says. 'It looks great on the telly.'" Next day, the picture was front-page news. Sweaty, blood-stained me and 300,000 new Iron Maiden fans. We relished it all, and the come-down from the show lasted all night. It was a late show in any case, so it was 4 or 5 in the morning when we got to the hotel. Our ears were still ringing, and alcohol seemed to have no soporific effect. The adrenaline rush was still overpowering the body's efforts to sleep. I walked into the hotel lobby at about 6 a.m. There were no fans. The road was deserted out to the beach, and the sun was deliciously, eyeball-roastingly warm just before it would become scorchingly unbearable. It was a strange feeling to be free after 6 days under siege. I indulged in the forbidden fruit of escaping without a minder and slowly crossed the road, took off my shoes and sat down on the beach, wiggling my toes in the hot sand. Not long now, and then back on a plane to the middle of winter. What a fucking weird life this is, I thought to myself. I looked to my left. There was Brian May, eyes closed, face towards the sun, probably thinking something similar. I left him to it. Funny old world, really. Chapter 22. Much ado about cutting. Arriving back in England, I promptly took myself off for 2 weeks to a fencing camp in Sussex and arrived back with a coaching qualification. I was rapidly coming to the conclusion that being a rock star was not all it was cracked up to be. The rest of the summer I spent training with Great Britain Olympic coach Shamik Wachowski. The fencing competition season kicked off in early September, so it was good for me to try prodding and poking someone other than Americans. I was, I think, ridiculously fit. I was training up to 5 days a week, sometimes twice a day, and if I had a competition, one of those days would be the competition itself. Fencing competitions tend to be one-day affairs. As many as 200-plus fencers are whittled down to a final of 2 by early evening. To get to a final 8 would normally involve starting at around 9 a.m. with a pool of 5 others, so 5 fights up to 3 minutes each. The next part involved sitting around and getting cold and bored, then the same again. Sometimes there would be a third round until the remaining fencers were placed in a knockout tournament, either from 128, 64 or 32. When it came to the knockout encounters, the fights became 3 rounds of 3 minutes, each to score up to 15 hits on the opponent. Over the years, this format has changed in minor ways, but the basics remain the same. To win a competition could therefore involve up to 40 3-minute rounds of fighting, each progressively harder as the opposition gets more effective towards the end. It's a very physically and mentally demanding sport. It's also an almost incomprehensible sport to an outsider. Watching a sword fight in a movie is all about seeing what is going on. Watching a real fencing bout is all about seeing what is being hidden. A fencing point is scored in a split second, and if you, as a spectator, could see it coming, it's almost certain that the opponent would see it too. High-definition and slow-motion replays help to explain what often resembles a catfight with a wobbly knitting needle, but it's very unsatisfactory. Fencing points are not always pretty, as we expect them to be after seeing sword fights in the movies. My satisfaction was entirely personal, and based on 2 pillars that I thought mattered. One was respect from your peers, the other fencers who shared a common sporting ethos, and the second was respect for the philosophy of the sport. What I liked about fencing was that there was no ending to it. Like other martial arts, every opponent is different, and being an expert is no guarantee of success against an awkward beginner. The enemy in fencing is as much yourself as the opponent. It's what I love the most about the sport. I learnt more than I could have imagined when I started to fence, and in just a couple of years I began to compete seriously. It would prompt me to question my very identity. It took nearly a full season of competition and training before I started thinking something was not quite right inside my brain. I'm not normally a very angry person. I can, on occasion, be a little volatile, and I become very passionate about certain things, but destructive anger, seldom. Yet, the further I advanced in competition, the more it seemed as if there was a pressure cooker inside my head that wanted to burst. I'd never experienced anything like it. I went back to the drawing board, the same way I learnt to sing again after discovering a different voice inside my body. A bit of research yielded a series of self-help questionnaires and a book of left brain, right brain puzzles by Professor Hans Eysenck. After filling in all the spaces and answering all the puzzles, my conclusion was that I used both sides of my brain equally. I was slap bang in the middle. It explained why I found it easy to talk to different types of people, but it provided little in the way of advice as to whether or not I might be left-handed or at least ambidextrous. The latter characteristic runs in the family. My father and my cousins are all ambidextrous. I fenced right-handed and always had done. I wrote right-handed, but wasn't any good at playing racket sports right-handed. I was left-footed, and I used my left eye to sight down rifles or look through telescopes. I also favoured my left ear when listening to the telephone. Cross-dominance in hand-eye coordination is not uncommon. It's an excellent setup for a cricket or baseball batsman. A right-hander with a dominant left eye sees the ball in his peripheral vision a fraction of a second quicker. There's a theory that in fast reaction sports, the left-hander is innately quicker in plotting a solution and therefore able to wait longer before making a decision, all of which puts more pressure on the opponent. I was now in my mid-20s. I looked at my rather puny left arm. There was a degree of muscle wastage from the nerve damage caused by all that headbanging. My right side was much stronger. Fencing is quite a one-sided sport, and even my legs had become lopsided as a result. I went back to my coach, Jamek. Could I, perhaps, be left-handed? Or at least, should I be left-handed? I put the sword in my left hand. He asked me just to step forward and back, extend my arm and hit him, not fast, just as smoothly and accurately as I could. You are immediately better left-handed, Jamek said. Next, he produced a piece of paper and asked me to draw an irregular polygon with my right hand, with my eyes closed, which I did. He put the pen in my left hand and asked me to draw the same shape. With my eyes firmly shut, I drew a mirror image of the shape, almost identical and exactly the same size. I think you should be the other way round, he said. I started again, but left-handed. I was slow and my coordination painful. The muscle memory was all wrong and had to be reprogrammed. My left arm tired quickly and my neck ached. It was twisted on the side from the head-banging injury. Various small muscles in my forearm had atrophied because of the disc problem. This was the rehab for my body, but it was like a revelation for my brain. The anger was gone. The will to win and the passion remained, but the pressure cooker had disappeared. The next chance I got, I went to a squash court by myself and took the racket in my left hand. The ball went, unexpectedly, exactly where I wanted it to go. I played with the ball as opposed to being angry with it. The difference in my head was staggering, as if I'd discovered an entire universe of unexpected beauty and movement, and above all, timing. Timing, as in the space between all things, had been unknown to me. I went back to training, but now left-handed. All of my fellow fencers thought I had completely lost my mind. It was true. I had lost one mind. Now I was using another one. Chapter 23. You'll believe a drummer can fly. I came very close to quitting music after the Power Slave tour. I was in no mood for any more backstage politics or solitary confinement in tour buses or gilded cages. I didn't expect others to understand, because I'm sure for many it might seem like the ultimate dream, but I wanted more than the challenge of standing still successfully. When it came time to go back to the grind, I thought we might change radically, just for the hell of it. It's not good to be in a minority of one in a 5-piece band. I was taken to one side and quietly put out of my misery by Martin Birch, who told me that my little acoustic numbers were not the stuff that was required. It was all pretty straightforward, and if you're going to be crushed, better to get it over with and move on. I'm not one to sulk for longer than 5 minutes, so I relaxed and I thought, how can I enjoy the next year? A small birdie sat on my shoulder and whispered in my left ear, "Why don't you just be the singer and let everyone else get on with it?" So instead of thinking about the big picture, I just thought about me, myself and I. For a while, it was quite a relief. We went to Jersey again, this time a different hotel, to write the next album. I didn't write any songs, so I went off to Europe to enter some fencing competitions. I had some pretty odd ideas about stage clothes. There were certainly some Spinal Tap moments coming our way, and I wanted to make sure that we were at the forefront of the excitement, however unwittingly. The album Somewhere in Time took a great deal of inspiration from the movie Blade Runner. The album's sleeve and even the intro tape for the show owed a great deal to the Ridley Scott classic. Cyborg Eddie was our most sophisticated walk-on monster, and the stage set was a fabulously complex creation of aluminium girders and ramps which rose up with inflatable clawed hands underneath. The idea was to use a lot of inflatables, but the technology was in its infancy, and so was some of the execution. Half the time, the inflatables didn't inflate, well, not fully anyway, and often it looked like the great clawed hand was giving the finger to the audience until the other digits managed to pump up the volume. Eddie's head, the great inflatable version, often took its time to get its second wind, and sometimes it just looked like a baggy bin liner. There were plans for overhead inflatable spaceships and my favourite, a spacewalking astronaut on an extendable scaffold above the audience. Alas, the spaceships either didn't fit the venue or health and safety dictated nothing hanging over the crowd, and we just gave up in the end. At least we had an exploding singer at the end of the first song, only that didn't quite work out either. I had decided, whilst the balance of my mind was disturbed, to have some stage clothes manufactured as opposed to stealing them from fancy dress shops. I remember the instructions I gave to the seamstress. What I want is a sort of D'Artagnan outfit, but from outer space. The bottom would look like a strange space lizard, recently killed, then patched together, preferably green and scaly looking. Got that? So, now you know. In keeping with the Blade Runner theme, I wanted a leather jacket with a giant illuminated beating heart, plus rope lights pumping sequence light around a sort of exoskeleton. I'm sure now it would all be done by CGI, but back then it ended up being designed by our monitor guy, John Thompson. The jacket weighed about 10 kilos, about 20 pounds. It was full of copper wire, and the power source was a 6-volt lead-acid battery, plus an on-off switch pinched from a bedside lamp. The power consumption was such that my beating heart went into cardiac arrest about 2 minutes before the end of the first song. The entire contraption is now somewhere in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where it's either locked up or being used as a bedside lamp. My idea was to have a black leather-looking suit that velcroed from top to bottom at each side. Embedded up the sides of the legs and arms would be flash pots, so that, in mock Vitruvian man pose, I would dissolve in a puff of smoke at the conclusion of the first song. So much for fantasy. As soon as I saw the 20-pound pigeon-chested jerkin I was saddled with, we had to compromise. We ended up with one tiny flash pot, highly unreliable, stuck on top of a glove with a 9-volt battery and a bizarre firing mechanism. It was very unremarkable even when it worked, and when it didn't, I was the loneliest quick-change artist in the world as I ran off stage with the device still live and liable to go off at any moment. Road crew dived for cover as I disarmed it before getting rid of my weight belt and illuminated straitjacket. I grew a beard on tour. In Las Vegas, Rod asked me to shave it off. I shaved half of it off, vertically. There are pictures. I'm not sure what the audience made of it. They probably thought I was off my face. Mind you, I was very lucky to have got as far as I had on the tour. For a variety of reasons and hazardous situations, I nearly didn't make it. I was busy fencing with my buddy Justin, and we would train together with shades of Rocky doing sprints up and down the steep hills. We devised a weekend adventure, which involved trains, planes, ships, and 2 fencing competitions in Belgium and Holland. We would return by overnight sleeper train to Cherbourg, where there was a morning flight back to Jersey, which took all of about 10 minutes according to the schedule. On the way to France, we missed the ferry, caught the later one across the channel, and missed the train. We slept on the floor of the ferry terminal, my head in my fencing bag, until we got the 5 a.m. train and fenced all day in Antwerp. We slept in an attic and had a very early start on the next train to Holland, fenced all day and went to Paris. 2 bottles of cheap wine and several hamburgers later, we boarded the train to Cherbourg, which, according to my Thomas Cook European Rail timetable, don't leave home without it, only ran on a Sunday night. We soon found out why. There were 600 French sailors on it. We went into one of the couchette compartments and thought better of it. We opted to sleep in the toilets instead. They smelt slightly better. Snow was on the ground on our arrival as we trudged through the darkness, unwashed and unloved, until we found a cafe that clearly never shut, and hot coffee revived us. There's not much demand on a Monday morning in Cherbourg for taxis to the airport, By the time we found one, the plane had gone, and the next one was in 10 hours' time. Nico can fly, I suggested. It was true. Nico was learning. His instructor was a very jolly fellow called Charlie, and Jersey Aero Club was a very salubrious place to have Sunday lunch and watch the planes go by. I managed to work out a French payphone and got him at the hotel. There's just two of us, I said. Dunno. See, I haven't got my licence yet. Maybe Charlie could do it with me. There you go. You can have a bit of a lesson on the way. What could possibly go wrong? Justin and I waited in the deserted cafe bar in Cherbourg Airport. No sooner had we arrived than it shut. After 2 hours, a lone small aeroplane, tossed around by the wind, landed and taxied up to the window. It was, as far as I could tell, the only aircraft in the airport. This was a first for me. I had never been in a light aircraft before, so my curiosity was overpowering the overall fatigue caused by 3 days of sleeping on floors, attics and in toilets and drinking cheap wine in between fencing competitions. The aircraft in question, I now know, was a Piper Cherokee 140. It was a single-engine, low-wing monoplane, and it had 4 very small seats. The 140 stood for horsepower. The same aeroplane also came equipped with a 160, a 180 and even a 200 horsepower motor. But all of them only had 4 seats. Therein lies a clue as to what happened next. In flying magazines, there are 2 popular types of column. One is, I learned about flying from that, and the other is, that worst day. Pilots love to talk about disasters, partly as a learning process, but mainly to remind them how invincible they secretly are, because that sort of thing would never happen to them. Justin and I showed our passports to the gendarme, and we walked over to the plane. There were only 2 doors, one for each pilot, and you had to climb on the top of the wing to scramble into the 2 back seats. Charlie looked concerned. Are they very heavy?" he asked, about the 2 bags we were carrying. My fencing bag, about the size of a golf bag, just like Justin's, was full of wet clothing, a stainless steel mask, all manner of bits of wire and tools, plus half a dozen weapons and spare clothes for a trip away. "Oh, not really," I said, trying hard not to expose the groove in my shoulder caused by dragging the wretched thing halfway across Europe. "Are we okay, Charlie?" asked Nico. Yeah, should be," but there was an unconvincing tone, and he was starting to pull so vigorously on his moustache that I thought it might come off. We clambered aboard and put the bags into the baggage compartment, where they still stuck out between the rear seats. I leaned back. The plane toppled over onto its tail. "Oh, shit," Nico muttered. "Is it supposed to do that? No, fuck, it's not." Charlie turned round and surveyed the scene behind him. 2 lads in the back, 2 heavy bags further back, Nico in the front, tail on the ground, nose wheel dangling in the air, gendarme starting to become interested. He finally spoke. "Right, lads, I've got an idea. Straight out of the Italian job, I thought, and appropriate too. The coach balanced on the precipice with the gold at one end. We were in exactly the same predicament. Everyone leaned forward. We did so. Nothing changed. Move the bags into the space between the front and back seats. We manhandled the bags until we were trapped behind them. Right, Nico, when I yell, start the engine." Charlie ran round to the tail and lifted it off the ground, cradling it whilst the nose wheel touched terra firma at last. "Start the engine!" I watched, fascinated, as Nico read the instructions. Now, of course, I know it's called a checklist, but it is in fact the instructions on how to start an engine. There was a series of squelches and squeaks, and a boing noise as he pulled a lever. He tapped several dials, rotated a couple of instruments, and filled the cabin with the overwhelming smell of gasoline. After pumping a small plunger into the dash, Nico stuck his head out of the door and shouted, "Clear prop!" This was splendid stuff, and I half expected a squadron scramble. Nico turned the ignition key, and the engine rattled into life. As soon as the prop was spinning, the plane settled on an even keel, and Charlie leapt into the seat, yelling, "I have control!" We taxied. Very fast, I thought, and the low clouds scurried rapidly over the runway in the strong, gusty winds. We careered onto the runway, and the racket from the engine and prop rose till the windows started to vibrate. "Everyone lean right forward!" Charlie yelled above the din, his own head pressed firmly against the dashboard. The runway in Cherbourg, I later discovered, is very long, which is good, because we needed all of it to get airborne. Despite what turned out to be a beneficial headwind on takeoff, the wheels barely left the ground at all. The altitude above sea level became clear when we fell, or rather almost fell, off the edge of the cliff that marked the end of the runway. Below us lay jagged rocks, a grey and angry sea with white horses cresting and crashing, and a low, miserable-looking cloud base to sandwich us. After about 5 minutes, I worked out what all the instruments were indicating, and 800 feet seemed to be about all we could manage. "Keep leaning forward," Charlie urged as another cliff came in sight, with a runway attached to the end of it. I noticed that Charlie was quite pale by now and was sweating. A lot. As we approached the ground, I noticed the runway dipped away and rose up in front of us. "Don't lean back, keep leaning forward." Charlie pulled back on the control column, but not very much, and we taxied very fast to park up on a patch of grass. There was a long sigh. "Oh, welcome to Jersey," said Nico. Nico got his pilot's license, and as you would expect from a drummer with all that coordination, he had a very good pair of hands when it came to flying an aeroplane. Later on, during the US leg of the tour, he flew himself around in a small turboprop owned by a commercial pilot who went with him as instructor. I tagged along on a few of their trips, and I was fascinated by the instruments. So fascinated, in fact, that a copy of Microsoft Flight Simulator was my next port of call, which I installed on the suitcase-sized monster that was the Mac Portable, or Mac Luggable, as I termed it. I was already on the slippery slope towards the runway. But first, I had to negotiate our last stop in the Bahamas and a prolonged stay in Amsterdam. Chapter 24. Double Dutch. The Bahamas was relatively brief. The rest of the album would be finished and mixed in Holland, in Hilversum, at Wisseloord Studios. Marvin still managed to make an appearance in quite memorable fashion. I was sound asleep, but the sun was already up. There was a loud banging from downstairs. Each small house had 3 bedrooms upstairs, and there was a courtyard at the back with an external door opening out onto the road, across from the studios. The initial banging was Marvin trying to get in. I woke up. The banging ceased, and I started to doze. Seconds later, the sound of splintering window frame, muffled shouts, a woman's voice, a door being kicked in, and the unmistakable sound of Martin in transformation. He knocked at my door. "Aha! Are you in?" "What is it?" "You need to come downstairs." "It's 7:30 in the morning." "Now! You need to come downstairs now." "Why do I need to come downstairs now?" I'd already started putting my pants on, or this would only end in tears, which it possibly would do anyway, but hey. "It's the most important person you will ever meet in the whole world." I put my trainers on. "And who might that be?" "Just get down here, boy." I heard a thumping crash as Marvin collided with the stairs. Downstairs, Marvin was standing on the furniture again, on one leg, but this time he was covered in earth, and his forearm was heavily bleeding. "Are you all right?" "Aha! All right. See!" He pointed to his eye. "This, the eye of the tiger." "Martin, you're bleeding." "Ha! This, the blood of the samurai." "Look, I would get that seen to. Do you want some antiseptic?" "Death! One blow, Shotokan." He hopped from one leg to the other. "For I am the court jester." I sighed. "I'll make a cup of tea." Martin had started out with good intentions several hours before, but had been misled by his own internal Mr. Hyde and finally ran out of people to drink with. After banging on my door at 7 a.m, he'd scaled the 8-foot wall and then fallen off into a rosebush, hence the earth, hence the blood. Undeterred, Marvin had scaled the trellis and kicked in the mosquito mesh, clambered into a roadie's bedroom, and then, imagining that my bedroom lay beyond, kicked the door open to reveal a naked lady, in flagrante, with another roadie. "Carry on, dear boy," was his response. So now the doorbell rang, and the last piece of the evening's jigsaw revealed itself. I opened the courtyard door, and there, immaculately dressed in dressing gown and slippers, was Robert Palmer, clutching a bottle of rum and 2 glasses. Martin and Robert went way back to the days when Martin worked with a band called Vinegar Joe. Robert was their singer. After running out of drinking partners and having not seen Robert for about 30 years, Marvin knocked on his door at 4 a.m. Unfazed, Robert greeted him with, "Martin, it's been a long time. Do come in." 1 bottle of rum had already been consumed, and the second was already half empty, I noted. "I'll make another cup of tea." "This is the most important man you'll ever meet," muttered Marvin, and then he went back out onto the balcony, standing on one leg overlooking the sea, but luckily always falling back onto dry land. I sat down opposite Robert. "I'm having so much trouble with the album," he began. "It's like a mountain, and I don't know where to start." I sipped my tea. "Try the steps," I suggested. "The steps?" "Yes, the steps are in the side of the mountain. That's what they're there for." "The steps," he whispered. "The steps, yes, I'll try the steps." And he wandered out of the door, saying, "Brilliant, of course, the steps. Use the steps." I finished my tea and left Marvin to his karate exercises. A couple of hours later, I walked out of the front door to find Marvin standing in the middle of the road, barefoot, still bleeding, and with a manic grin on his face. His hands clutched at the pockets of his shorts, which had been turned inside out. "Keys, dear boy," he said. "Can't find the house keys." Marvin finally got put to bed, and before long we decamped to a place of even greater temptation, the flesh pots of Amsterdam. The studio in Hilversum was boring as hell. It was in a complex used mainly for TV and radio, so we had to put up with the Smurfs in the next-door studio and the world's most boring cheese sandwiches in the canteen. Hilversum itself is a deathly quiet conservative suburb, and Steve stayed there. I stayed in Amsterdam, in a loft apartment with a circular staircase and great triangular wooden beams. Downstairs was a nightclub, open till dawn, a gay cinema, and 3 red-light window girls. The central station was a 10-minute walk away, and I quickly purchased a stolen bike for 25 guilders. I had a stack of books to read, and I bought a candelabra, and I would eat in the Italian restaurant next door, carafe of wine, candelabra, and Book of the Month Club. Boring it was not, and as I got to know the locals, life became yet more illuminating. I asked Steve why he didn't stay in the centre of Amsterdam. "Too much dog shit," he muttered. Not entirely incorrect, I have to say, and the size of some of the droppings was quite extreme. Not the dog's fault. The size of some of the dogs matched the unwanted logs they deposited on the curb. One such dog was a huge Great Dane that hung out with the equally huge Hell's Angel at the neighbouring Café Midnight. Café Midnight no longer exists, and the gay couple who ran it may or may not have been released from jail by now. But the web that was spun out of one establishment was typical of the underbelly of what, on the surface, was a happy-go-lucky, free-spirited city. Henrik, shall we call him, was the capo di capo of Hell's Angels in the city. Incredibly tall and mild-mannered, his girlfriend worked the bar at the cafe, and she was trouble. But one look at her, and it was easy to see why men and women fell over every which way. She had already been responsible for the downfall of a Dutch cabinet minister and was herself ministering to my very entrepreneurial Hell's Angel friend. "I'm going through hell with the girlfriend," he told me. "I'm sorry to hear that. Let's go for a drink." So began a long evening of small beers, ending up in a deserted nightclub with the sun rising over the canals. He explained his business empire and his philanthropic nature. "We run the chapter like a sort of social security club." "Well, that's nice." "Yeah, for example, one of my guys was dying of cancer, so we all got together and got him something, to make him feel better." "Well, what did you get him?" "A washing machine." A washing machine? Yeah, exactly. He was in tears. He said nobody had ever brought him a washing machine before. That's the sort of stuff we do. Good, eh? But oh, fuck, I got a big shipment I'm waiting for this month. Washing machines? I ventured. No, drugs. Gosh, how big is the shipment? I was picturing a couple of plastic bags or a sack at the most. Oh, a container full, he said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I looked around the empty nightclub. The windows were all portholes, I realised, for a port city. That sounds like a lot of stress, let alone the girlfriend. Yeah, he sighed, world-weary entrepreneur that he was. You get it wrong, you end up in the bottom of the river. He had a sip of Heineken. You know, last time I was in here, a guy tried to shoot me with a Luger. 7 shots. You're a big chap. He must have been a rotten shot. Yeah, that's what I told him when I got hold of him. I didn't press that line of inquiry further. It's been really good to talk, he said. I feel much better. Nights like these were surreal windows into the not-so-nice side of Amsterdam. Often I would end up in a late-night club opposite my apartment. There was a very happy hooker who came in after work. She was Australian and was always delighted to see me. "Struth, mate, you're not bad looking. Fancy a freebie?" I politely declined. "No, mate, seriously, straight up, I'll blow your mind." Probably not the only thing that would get blown, I imagine, but I surprised myself by sticking to beer and conversation. She had a bandage on her arm. "What happened there?" I asked. "Oh, geez, mate, some fucking guy got out of jail and turned up to work and then he starts trying to fucking bite me and draws blood." She was a window girl, so walk-in trade was the norm. She was personable and quite good-looking. I was baffled by why she did it. "Still, the cops are great. They banged him up right away. They take a very dim view of beating up the girls." This was a harsh place beneath the fluffy, open city propaganda. No one I met was quite what they seemed. The Liverpudlian scallywag on the run from the British police, happily settled down with a stunning Dutch girl and 2 children. The Mancunian with a barge full of empty clay pots and vases from Thailand for sale, no clue as to what might have been contained within them during their transit, of course. There was the happy couple that painted John Lennon's Rolls-Royce and made stage clothes for Led Zeppelin and tried to sell me a piano and introduce me to the new drug, ecstasy. My ecstatic moments did not revolve round drugs. I'd found the most bizarre fencing club in a basement. The coach was wonderfully mad and gave lessons outside by the canal on the cobblestones. The basement was so small that fighting was only possible if you fenced across the room diagonally, and even then you ran out of space after 3 or 4 steps. My Australian window girl lived just down the street, and one evening she invited me to her flat, saying, "There's someone I want you to meet." Frankly, I didn't want to go, but she was insistent. "Oh, very well," I said, "but just 5 minutes." Up the dingy staircase, 1, 2, 3 floors up, twisting around in the old wooden-framed building. "Who is this person?" I said. "Is he a fan or what?" "Shh!" Suddenly she looked concerned. A quick glance over her shoulder was, I thought, a trifle melodramatic. "He's the most wanted man in Holland," she said. "I'm sorry?" "Yeah, mate, he's on the run and just hanging out with me for a few days." I entered the small flat, and 2 men were sitting around the kitchen table. They weren't exactly talkative. "Here's my mate, Bruce," she said. I smiled, but not really. "Thanks, nice to meet you. Well, I really must be going." I exited very quickly. I don't know if she was dishing out freebies for fugitives as a sort of public service, but I was glad I never indulged. Amsterdam was like that, unpredictable and sometimes tragic, like our Liverpool scallywag with a gorgeous Dutch girlfriend. She ended up in a French jail after he persuaded her to drive to France with her children, carrying drugs in boxes of chocolate. He ended up being slit from one side of his stomach to the other in a knife attack. Nice people, drug dealers. You can't persuade me that Robin Hood is out there selling dope. Not anymore. As for the girl in Cafe Midnight, she lost her job when the building was set on fire by the proprietors. Alas for them, they didn't do a good job and returned with more petrol a couple of hours later. The next-door neighbour had already alerted the police because of the smell of gasoline. Even then, bail was jumped, but the miscreants were dumb enough to re-enter Holland and ended up staying rather longer than they intended. 10 years, to be exact. Amsterdam is also the only city in Europe where I've had a gun pulled on me after I remonstrated with the car that almost ran me down outside the American hotel. It's not just dog shit. that is on the streets of Amsterdam. So, with a bit more of an education than I got from my A-levels, I moved on to be fired from the starting cannon that was the Somewhere in Time World Tour. Chapter 25. You cannot be serious. The Marquis de Sade wrote famously gross fantasies, though he never got the opportunity to play some of them out. He was firmly locked up for much of the duration of his writing career, where the only materials available for composing his scatological hymns were toilet paper. For very different reasons, on the Somewhere in Time tour, I found myself shackled in hotel rooms around the globe, and in the spirit of, what does this button do? I decided to write a saucy comic novel. Well, because I could, and there was plenty of hotel stationery to do it on. The end result was The Adventures of Lord Iffy Boat Race, a hybrid of Tom Sharp's Wilt series and Carry On Camping style innuendo. The blame for this fledgling writing career must go down to only being runner-up in the English prize at Birkdale Preparatory School. Second place was always going to be Life's Cattle Prod, and the shock treatment was administered by horror writer and Iron Maiden fan Sean Hudson. I've read most of Sean's popular horror fiction. I've also had no choice in the matter, because he gave them to me and everyone else in the band. I could see the formula in what he did, but also the hand of the artisan in the way he delivered the story. What I enjoyed was the way that the books actually produced a physical reaction. This was not long-winded character development and descriptions of detailed sunsets or locations. This was a universal, gratuitous page-turner with an outrageous death every few pages. Jane Austen, eat your heart out and leave the bleeding mess pumping helplessly as the coppery smell of blood filled the room. The walls sprayed as his fist pumped and crushed the organ, wrenched from the smashed ribs which stood upended like broken teeth. Sorry, couldn't resist a go at a Sean Hudson homage. Personally, I recommend the passage from Slugs, where the paraplegic is eaten from the inside out whilst taking a shit by a spine-consuming slug that crawls out of the toilet and into his anal passage, as opposed to his literary passage. How on earth do you write a book? I asked. Well, I just start in the morning, have a cup of tea about 11, then write till 5, with a break for lunch, Sean replied. You mean it's just hard work? Yeah, mainly. Well, how long does it take you to write a book? I inquired. Oh, about 3 weeks. It took us 3 months to make an album. 3 weeks must be unbelievably intense, I thought. What do you do to relax? I asked. 24-hour horror movie marathons, he replied. Thank God Sean Hudson was an author and not a mass murderer. I fear he would have been very efficient. I started to write. Every day I vanished from view. I no longer appeared at the bar. I was the invisible man on tour. One day, in Finland, there was a knock at the door. I opened it and there was a member of the crew. I could see he was craning his neck to peer at the paper spread round the room, the curtains drawn and all the lights on. The lads are wondering, what are you doing? I'm writing a story. What sort of a story? The bar decamped to my room, and for the rest of the tour, I had to read every chapter of The Adventures of Lord Iffy Boat Race to the road crew as I wrote them. If I didn't produce a chapter sufficiently quickly to entertain them on a day off, there would be complaints. I had a series of mini deadlines to keep, and at the end of the tour, I had a large sheaf of papers, all belonging to various 4- and 5-star hotels, which had been conveniently placed for correspondence in my bedroom. It was my version of the Marquis de Sade's toilet paper. Astonishingly, Sidgwick and Jackson eventually published the book and promptly commissioned the sequel. Pan Macmillan followed suit by putting both books into paperback and giving me a 3-book paperback deal. The Adventures of Lord Iffy Boat Race took a while to get into print, but amazingly sold 30,000 copies, and suddenly I realised that I had a deadline and the sequel to write. My 2-fingered typing skills were put severely to the test as I invested in that most ridiculous portable contraption, the original Mac Portable. With its suitcase-sized case, bicep-building weight, and 6-volt lead-acid battery with enough juice to jump-start a Fiat Uno, the Mac Portable still managed to run out of power after about 2 hours. It was possible to extend its life by switching off the backlight, but then, of course, you couldn't see anything at all except in bright sunlight. It was good for people with colour blindness, being only available with screens in black and white, and on a trip anywhere, it was a simple choice, computer or clothes, but not both. As with everything Mac back in the 80s, it was all about style and nothing to do with practicality. Even while I was staggering up flights of steps with my spine-crippling device, admiring humans would stop me in awe. "Is that a Mac Portable?" they would inquire, as if about to touch a holy relic. "Yes, it fucking is," I'd reply. "Would you like to carry it for me?" I wrote big chunks of the sequel, The Missionary Position, on trains and on tour, and the rest of it whilst drinking pints of tea at home. I found sleeper trains particularly useful. Nobody bothered you, and you didn't do much sleeping, so bashing away at the keys made sense in the tiny compartments rattling through the night. So incensed was I at the withdrawal of the Manchester to London sleeper that I included it in the credits on the sleeve. I don't suppose anybody else used it. Sleeper trains have always featured on tour, if at all possible. Before Google, I always carried the Thomas Cook European Rail Timetable. One evening in Lausanne after a show, the talk in the bar was becoming very tedious, so a quick glance at the European timetable revealed a sleeper train to Venice, which sounded like a good place to wake up. Travelling light with only a rucksack suited me just fine. I think I make tour managers nervous. Managers even more so. The main reason I liked trains was for the time to think the journey offered, in a degree of peace and quiet. Modern trains, alas, are becoming less and less like that, but there's still something theatrical about boarding a train. Its size and speed are momentous, even if its interior is nowadays a bland mix of plastic with coffee-stained cushions, unemptied waste bins, and toilets ankle-deep in unfathomable liquids. Once in New York, I decided to take the train to New Haven, just up the coast. The local trains were commuter machines and not terribly interesting, so I opted for Amtrak from Penn Station with a proper locomotive and an egg and cheese muffin. 2 p.m. we pulled out of the platform, and shortly thereafter we stopped, and we stayed stopped. For 2 going on 3 hours, we remained stationary. Luckily, I had my copy of the OAG Pocket Flight Guide with me, never leave home without it, and I discovered a flight to New Haven from LaGuardia. I asked the guard what was going on. "The lines are down," he said. "We're waiting for a diesel train to take us back to Penn Station." I was going to miss the show if I didn't catch that plane. "I have to get off this train. I have to get to New Haven." The guard shrugged. "It's going to be a few hours yet." A young lad had overheard the conversation. "Are you in Iron Maiden?" he asked. "Yes, I am." "I can get you off this train." I stopped in my tracks, much like the carriage I was in. "If you can get me off this train, you're coming with me to the show, backstage, the whole lot." We went to the door, and he pulled a couple of levers, and it slid to one side with a lazy action as if to say, "I'm not really supposed to open this way, but if you must." We jumped onto the tracks, ran down the embankment, scaled a chain-link fence into a US Postal Service depot, and ran out onto a suburban street. I flagged down the first driver I saw. "How far is LaGuardia?" "Hey man, it's right over there. $100 if you take me and my friend." We got the last 2 seats on the tiny plane, and I got to the gig 10 minutes before showtime. The Somewhere in Time tour came to an end somewhere, and we languished in England again at last. I was living in the countryside, or the suburban version of it, in Buckinghamshire, just outside London. I had a swimming pool, because I don't like swimming, a tennis court, because I didn't play tennis, a garden, because I disliked gardening, and a very long walk to the nearest pub, because all I required was a quiet pint without having to drive there and break the law on the way back. Be careful what you wish for, as the saying goes. There was a big garage for the bright red BMW I didn't drive, and there was a snooker room, long and wooden-floored, because I didn't play snooker. It was, however, long enough to fence in, so I chucked out the snooker table and turned it into a training room. Around this time, a very colourful Hungarian entered my life and remained in it for the next 25 years, taking me from a place where I didn't know my left from my right to winning the British Junior Foil Championship. Between us, we won the British Team Championship and represented Great Britain at the European Championships under the unlikely auspices of Hemel Hempstead Fencing Club. There were only a dozen of us, meeting up 2 or 3 times a week in dismal school gymnasiums or community centres. The irascible, eccentric and utterly brilliant coach behind the whole setup was my Hungarian mentor, Zsolt Vadasfi. Zsolt had white hair, spoke like Count Dracula, and had girls swooning in the aisles despite being twice their age. He'd been one of Hungary's youngest foil prodigies, but his career in sport was curtailed by the arrival of a Russian tank under his window during the Soviet crackdown of the Budapest uprising. At the age of 16, Zsolt took his passport and walked into Austria. He taught fencing across Europe, and he also ended up as an actor in the Ipcress File, The Evil Bulgarian Doctor, and a racing car driver, before running an import-export business for white goods. His first and last love was fencing. When we buried him, it was with his fencing glove atop the coffin and his sword by his side. Zsolt was almost a second father to my fencing friend Justin in social as well as sporting terms. Zsolt lived on the other side of the valley from my adapted snooker room. He came round and we started to train. I realised after a while that I'd never had a coach who'd taken the time to teach me how to think. When martial artists speak of someone being a master, this, I imagine, is what they mean. In fact, a fencing master is beyond a coach. He imparts a philosophy of thought, strategy, and movement. It's intensely personal, and it's hard to describe the level of commitment that goes into a one-on-one fencing lesson given at full speed. At some point in the evolution of the relationship between master and pupil, enlightenment occurs. I mean this literally. It's as if a chain has snapped and your body and mind have been freed of intention, freed of the tyranny of what if and the consequent fear of failure. It happened to me on a few occasions when, for 20 minutes or so out of our 45-minute lesson, we played only with distance, movement, and the feel of the engagement and disengagement of the blades. Consciousness was transferred to the point of a bendy piece of steel, which prodded and conversed with the partner opposite, no longer an opponent, but simply a collaborator in the dance. No words are exchanged. The actions start and stop, and are resumed according to the language of the blade alone. Afterwards, it's hard to explain to people where you have been, so it's best not to try. In the beginning, of course, it's not like that. In the beginning, it is awkward footwork, unsteady coordination, patient repetition, constant correction, and constant frustration until the movements start to automate and the mind can control the intention without having to worry about the act. I was lucky that my first teacher at school, John Worsley, taught me well. Not so much on a technical level as on an intellectual one. He taught as a teacher, not just a coach. Every action was analysed. Every action had a motivation, even if it was only, I want to give up and go home. When Bruce Lee wrote his classic, The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, he based his analysis of offensive, defensive, and counter-offensive actions on the system developed by Western fencing. It's a very effective and clear analytical tool to pull combat apart, and even tennis matches for that matter, because any one-on-one sport is, in effect, combat by proxy. Chapter 26. Moonchild. All of this extracurricular activity was bound to be impacted eventually by Iron Maiden, and so began the writing process for our next album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. It would be one of our best. Steve was constructing the bones of the album out in Essex at his home, Shearing Hall, which had a replica pub, a real football pitch with home and away dressing rooms, and eventually a rehearsal room and a recording studio. Steve and I reignited our songwriting partnership. He mentioned the words concept album and my ears pricked up and my heart began to beat faster. Story, theatre, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son had it all. Except it didn't. Not quite all of it. Somewhere in my dusty collection of mouldy scribblings, I have the short story that tells the tale of the seventh son and his family issues and unrequited love that lead him to take a terrible and tragic revenge. We never really consummated the story relationship. My lyrics alluded to the story, whereas Steve's didn't. None of this matters that much in the overall picture because the show, the album cover and the title track were more than epic enough to satisfy the faithful. I would just have liked to have given it a bit more, even to the extent of a graphic novel. Germany was our destination to record at the improbable location of the Arabella high-rise building, a hotel in Munich. Musicland Studios was down in the bowels of the building, amongst the heavily lagged heating and sewer pipes, laundry baskets and kitchen equipment. It reminded me in many respects of Ian Gillan's Kingsway Studios down in the car park basement of the Civil Aviation Authority building in Holborn, London. Martin Birch had recorded Deep Purple in rock down there, and of course I'd been later dragged out of the toilets covered in sick by Ian Gillan. The studio itself at Musicland was tiny and the control room cramped, but some great albums had been produced there, everything from Queen to Rainbows Rising. For recreation, there was a notorious nightclub called the Sugar Shack, and casualties were frequent and painful. I discovered the local fencing club, MTV München, and set about training and improving my table dancing. The Germans were very enamoured of post-training drinking and dancing. I could do a half-decent Cossack dance if plied with enough beer, and the Greek restaurant seemed to enjoy the spectacle. Wheat beer was a new experience, and it came in brown, blonde and Hefe varieties, the latter being full of yeasty bits, more reminiscent of Marmite soup. All of them made your head hurt the next day. We all went a little stir-crazy in Munich. Dave Murray had decided to try a little conjuring in his spare time, of which there was far too much. One famous evening on the 16th floor, Marvin appeared when Dave was attempting to make something disappear. "See that chair?" Marvin growled. "I can make that disappear." So he chucked it off the balcony. This stir-crazy stuff was starting to get serious. I had a plan to save my sanity, and when the opportunity to escape the awful brown and green apartment came, I pottered up the road to what was then the capital of this side of a divided Germany, Bonn. I rented a small bedsit, bought a second-hand telly, and put a mattress on the floor. I would fence full-time at the elite Fechtclub Bonn, a Bundesleistung Trainingszentrum. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? I was one of the oldest guys there, and I still wasn't 30 yet. It was entirely dedicated to producing champions, and everyone thought I was a bit mad, especially as I was still getting to grips with using my left hand. I completely forgot about albums, music, and all the rest of it. I had breakfast, went for a walk, went training, then for a beer, watched telly, and then went to bed. A young journalist and a photographer from the Daily Mirror turned up. I invited them up for a cup of coffee to discuss the article they were going to write. It was obviously Iron Maiden related. When I went down to the front of the building with the photographer, he asked where the journalist was. "I left her upstairs," I replied innocently. He looked at me aghast. "I wouldn't do that." "Really?" I replied. "Surely she wouldn't go through any personal stuff, would she?" We retrieved her from my dirty laundry and tins of baked beans. She looked genuinely horrified at where I was living. "Why do you live like this?" she said. "What's wrong with it?" I replied indignantly. It was as if having a simple life was an affront to the gods of gossip, which I suppose it is, really. I learnt a few things about Germans, and one of them is that they love to discuss bodily emanations, especially poo. I caught a bad cold and was feeling a bit miserable. I'd been invited round to Sunday lunch with Thomas, another fencer. A dozen of us sat around with me shivering away. "You are sick," Thomas announced, and went to a back room. After some rummaging around, he came back with a long piece of brown flexible pipe and what looked like a stirrup pump. "Here, take this," he proudly offered. "What is it?" I inquired cautiously, although I had a pretty good idea. "Well," he grinned broadly, "this tube you put up your ass, and this you fill with water, and in a few minutes you will shit like thunder." There were murmurs of agreement from round the table. "Thomas, that's an enema," I said. "Yeah, exactly so." "Thomas, what gave you the idea that an enema will make me better?" "Oh, yeah, for sure. I use it all the time." Louder voices of agreement from the guests. "My mother gave me them from childhood." "Your mother?" Thomas's sister piped up. "Oh, not just Thomas. We all had them together, the whole family." Shit happens, as the saying goes. The family that enemas together stays together. Eventually, the band joined me, and we rehearsed in nearby Cologne, in a nightclub that was also a gymnasium. I believe the owner was eventually entertained by the German government for a number of years, because the powders he was selling certainly weren't Beecham's. I'd worked with Derek Riggs on the cover for the album, which had a touch of Salvador Dali about it, with its slightly surreal procession of candles and a partially disembodied skeletal Eddie. Next to Power Slave, it's my favourite Derek Riggs cover art. The stage set was enormous and was based around being elemental, as in ice. The tour was predictably successful, particularly in Europe, where we were hitting the big festivals, famously Donington in the UK. Sadly, that day was marred by tragedy, with death and injury on account of the appalling muddy conditions underfoot caused by torrential rain. We were spared the details of the terrible event until after the show had finished. Any moment of triumph was short-lived. Nothing is worth the cost of a human life, especially not an entertainment event. There have been subsequent situations that we've had to manage. A more light-hearted one was when the entire electrical supply at Earl's Court decided to weld itself together halfway into the set, and all power was lost to sound and lights for a full 40 minutes. The crew did an amazing job of splicing together high-voltage cables and restoring power while we juggled, pulled faces, played football with the audience, and generally kept the plates spinning. These are times when you can be truly proud. In Rio, at the Olympic Arena, an entire section of barrier collapsed in a heap of jagged aluminium. The barrier was a cheap copy of a successful design, but had been built using substandard materials instead of high-grade metal. I stood with a translator for half an hour as we persuaded the crowd to leave and come back the next day. That they did so and didn't trash the place is testament to the simple interaction between human beings. Back in 1988, the Seventh Son Tour was all conquering. But equally interesting for me was meeting video director, editor and auteur in general, Julian Doyle, who was initially called in to direct Can I Play With Madness? Julian and I went on to direct and storyboard several more ideas and, of course, the Oscar-defying feature film Chemical Wedding, starring Simon Callow as Aleister Crowley. Before Aleister Crowley, though, came Monty Python. Julian was Python's film guru. He reassembled the film Brazil from the cutting room floor, having finished large chunks of it himself because Terry Gilliam was ill. As an editor, his credits extended to virtually all the Python films, and he taught at film schools and was his own lighting director and cameraman. After directing Donald Sutherland and Kate Bush in Cloudbusting, Julian was asked to come up with ideas for Can I Play With Madness? He managed to engage Graham Chapman to perform in the video. Graham was sadly quite ill from throat cancer during filming. He, along with Chris Aylmer from my old band Samson and Steve Gadd, our long-time assistant tour manager and friend, would all perish from the same awful disease. It would be 26 years before my own diagnosis of the same cancer. I loved the video and was eager to chat to Julian because I loved to write and because all of my lyrics were pictorial, at least in my head. When I sang, I saw movies of the story unfolding. All my voice did was tell the tale of the theatre in my mind. Julian regaled me with tales of time bandits, Harvey Weinstein and errant Beatles. "Why don't you do an Eddie movie?" he suggested. I thought about it and wrote several treatments, but it was obvious to me that it was neither the time nor the place for an Eddie movie, even if it could have been smuggled past the Maiden gatekeeper, Rod Smallwood. It was just not a possibility. "How about doing a movie about Aleister Crowley?" I asked. "Nobody's done one." Hold that thought. Chapter 27. Slaughtering Daughters. The album and tour of Seven Son put us squarely in arena and festival headline territory. I had, by the end of the tour, acquired a wardrobe of fabulously potty trousers, hairy shirts, and various masks, including a rather fetching Goat of Mendes number with 2-foot-long antlers. To keep ourselves sane on the road, I had my fencing, Adrian had his fishing, and Steve had his own football team, often imported for matches. Most of us played, and some of the matches were genuinely momentous, especially for someone like me, who was left-footed and, just for good measure, God had equipped me with another left foot as a spare. Adrian was quite a skillful player, and he had some style. He was deceptively tricky. In many respects, his timing was remarkably similar to his guitar playing. Steve, of course, was principal striker, not by right, but by agreed ability. I enjoyed midfield. I liked close marking and the frustration generated when the opposition saw their passes thwarted or their strikers denied. It was a tactical style, and actually was not dissimilar to playing flanker in rugby union, which was my most successful position when I played the game from 11 to 16 years old. After that, I was getting a little small, or maybe other folk became larger. Iron Maiden FC opened for an international game between Canada and Greece, and I had to mark the singer from a band called Glass Tiger, who was quite useful. Sadly for him, the pitch was in poor condition, and after I chased him around for 45 minutes, he twisted his ankle and was stretchered off. "I never touched him, ref." Honest. We played the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, as a football team, of course, which was pretty mind-blowing. And finally, we played the Estonian side, Flora Tallinn, in 2000, and achieved notoriety in the Times by hospitalising Mark Poom, Derby County's Estonian goalkeeper, who was appearing as a guest in the game. "Stretchered off with undisclosed injuries to his testicles" was, I believe, the newspaper quotation that tells you all you need to know about the match. We worked hard and played hard. I would sneak off to train with the Canadian fencing team, or indeed the Japanese team for that matter. It's the small, hidden worlds that keep you on the straight and narrow on tour. I'd seen far too many casualties along the way and realised that, as I'd thought in that hotel corridor on the Number of the Beast tour, the music business will drive you nuts if you let it. Returning home after a tour is a bit like rejoining society after a spell in prison, or being a missionary, or living like a hermit and taking mind-altering quantities of adrenaline every day. It is strange. I moved back to West London from Buckinghamshire and immediately bought a 4-foot-long radio-controlled U-boat replica. I still have it, and I came perilously close to buying a real sub. Why a children's charity would want to purchase a Royal Navy diesel-electric submarine was something I couldn't quite fathom. Purchase it, though, they did, and according to the Daily Mail, they were now keen to unpurchase it. I came up with a plan to start submarine cruises across the Atlantic for enthusiasts. When they finally got the straitjacket on me and put me in the padded cell, I relented and agreed that there might not be a huge market for such a hands-on experience. After I'd calmed down, I went back to having a few pints of beer by the River Thames and watching ducks and swans go by. This is where Yannick Gers and I start to get into double trouble. I'd known Yannick from his days in a band called White Spirit, who were contemporaries of Samson. We were both Ian Gillan fans, and Yannick clearly had a bit of Mr. Blackmore infusing his style, in particular the spectacular knee-wobbling lunges that would punctuate his dancing antics. Imagine a whirling dervish with a guitar being suddenly deposited onto a red-hot plate, and it may give you may give and it plate hot to a red onto positive sudden the guitar a word imagintic dance just bubbling neat skilled in star in black bit of clearly Yannick fans Ian about Amsterdam is contemporary of wise in about from his known double dot guy Yannick this is go but and swing duck and 10 beer if you back to arm down after a fucking haircut than whether you can play guitar. Yannick was selling his equipment, his old Stratocasters, Marshall cabs, and vintage amps. He was doing a sociology degree and thought about teaching, or, well, anything except music. I admired his sincerity, but he was far too good to be wasted on teaching sociology. In my tiny brain, I hatched a plan. I had a bizarre offer which might just be a solution to his problem.